Hello. Thank you everyone for coming out on a Friday night. Tonight we're here to listen to Victor LaValle talk about his latest book, The Devil in Silver. Victor LaValle is the author of two previous novels, The Ecstatic and Big Machine, as well as a collection of stories called Slapboxing with Jesus and an ebook-only novella, which I didn't know about until I just looked it up, called Lucretia and the Croons. He teaches writing at Columbia University. He's won the American Book Award, the Shirley Jackson Award, and others. And just anecdotally, he's won the love of many people, as when I told people that we were having an event with Victor LaValle tonight, not many people have read the book yet because it's new, but everyone said, "Oh my God, I loved Big Machine," or "Oh my God, I loved Slapboxing with Jesus." So you have lots of fans here, is what I have to say. So please join me in welcoming Victor LaValle.
Thank you, everybody. Can you all hear me? Projecting way back. All right. So I know at least half of you, so I'm gonna demand. Move your asses up. Up. Bring it close. I love you all so much, even the ones I don't know. Move it up. I appreciate it. Or else you make me feel like I stink. So, and I'm sure I don't. So, all right. Thank you, everybody. You're very kind. All right. So, for me, whenever I'm at one of these events at a reading, or whatever, rather than just hearing the writer just sort of drone on read from a book droningly for 45 minutes, and then ask questions, I always like it if there's a little bit of if you learn a little something about how or why the book came about, and then they read a little bit, and then you hear a little bit more conversation. So that's the way I'm going to do this, so it feels a little bit more human. And as a reader, I always also like to know like where the real thing came from that sort of spawned whatever I'm about to hear in the book. So actually, the first section I'm going to read was inspired by a couple years ago. Now, how many years ago was it? I was at McDowell Arts Colony, and 4 years ago, and there was one. So McDowell Arts Colony is a great colony. If any of you here are writers or artists of any kind, I would recommend that you go, because they give you like a cabin in the woods, and that's all you have to know. It's amazing. One of the people I met there was this very old woman named Dorinda, who was a fellow there. She had written 1 or 2 books, but in truth, she was kind of, it seemed to me at least, kind of a pariah among a lot of the other fellows. She was kind of daffy, older lady. She was also an older lady which is like the group who's most often shunned, I find, in any kind of social situation. And she was just sort of left off to the side a lot of times. At the dinners, we have dinners each night, she could often be found sitting alone at a table, while everyone else, we were all sort of congregating. She didn't feel welcome, maybe she wasn't welcome, I don't know what. But for whatever reason, I sort of struck up a friendship with her. And within the first conversation, she started telling the story about when she was a kid. She remembered waking up in her bed, looking across the room, and she saw a midget on a stool, and the midget told her she was going to die. And she started telling me this whole vivid tale about some horrible things she'd been through when she was that age. And I realized this is why nobody wants to talk to this lady, because she's given off this energy, this vibe that she doesn't even necessarily realize she's giving off. And it made me want to start writing a story about a woman who was a witch who didn't know she was a witch. You know what I mean? And this idea she's doing something supposedly evil, but she's actually a good person. That story was terrible, so I never showed that story to anybody. It was very stupid. But she did inspire a feeling of this idea that there are people who we think we understand, we think we know to put off or whatever, and we're wrong. You know, they can be good deep down. And it inspired a lot of the characters, and that experience inspired a lot of the characters, but one in particular, an old woman named Dory, who is one of the main characters in this book. Now Dory meets our actual main character, a guy named Pepper, who's a big dude. He's 6'3", 272 pounds. He's brought into New Hyde Mental Hospital by 3 police. And he's brought in because he's got into a fist fight with the police. Because he thought he was helping out a friend, protecting a friend. He saw these 3 dudes in sweatsuits and stuff. Didn't realize they were cops. Beat them up. And you are never allowed to beat up the NYPD, whether they are in uniform or not. And so they took him to New Hyde Mental Hospital. He gets to the hospital, and the first person he meets is this woman, Dory, based on Dorinda. And she serves as his sort of guide through the mental hospital. That first night, Thursday night, he's given like a big dose of pills to essentially sedate him, and he passes out that night. He wakes up Friday morning, and they give him another dose of pills, his morning dose. And as he leaves his room after taking that morning dose, he wanders toward trying to get lunch in the television lounge, where he meets up with Dory. And that's what I'm going to read now. The nurse's station was a rectangular desk area with 2 tiers. The outer tier stood as tall as a bar top. Behind that top tier was a second one, lower, where staff members could sit and work at desk height. Pepper saw the tops of 4 heads. He didn't recognize any of these people from the intake team last night. 2 nurses, an orderly, and a social worker were all in there, hunched over, heads down, filling out forms in the natural posture of the public hospital worker. Pepper wanted to walk over and ask about that phone call, but first he had to make his mind understand what his eyes were seeing. The image wasn't blurry. 4 staff members worked inside the nurse's station, but the meaning of that image made less sense. He could have been looking at a giant terracotta pot, the tops of the 4 heads like 4 plants just breaking the surface of the soil. He was swaying and didn't even realize Dory had grabbed his hand until she yanked on his pinky. She looked up at him, unsmiling. "You better hurry if you want breakfast. They're about to shut down. Are you hungry?" "It's 8:25, Dory told him, and to Pepper her voice sounded faster, a bit daffier than it had the night before. "They shut breakfast down at 8:30 and don't serve food again until lunch. You want to wait that long?" He didn't. He couldn't. His naturally big appetite had been enhanced. "Wait," Pepper said. "How could it be 8:30? Dory pointed at a wall where no clock hung. She kept her finger pointed there as if he just couldn't see it. The nurse had given Pepper those pills at 7 a.m. He'd lost almost an hour and a half since then. Those 2 little pills had walloped his ass. But she essentially gets him to the television lounge where they sit down to have breakfast. Dory brought Pepper to a tall wheeled cart, like the kind used in school cafeterias, gray as a gunship with large black wheels at the base. An orderly stood there but didn't seem like he wanted to linger. The orderly removed the last full tray and almost handed it to Pepper, but Pepper couldn't get his hands raised. His arms just stayed there at his sides, even though the fingers did wiggle. Dory took the tray for him, and with that, the orderly checked his watch, 8:32, and pushed the cafeteria cart out of the television lounge. Dory moved toward an empty table farthest from the other patients. The tables and chairs were the kind of dining sets you might buy from a defense contractor. They lacked any beauty and weren't even comfortable. But neither the people who sold it in bulk, nor the people who purchased it in bulk were ever going to sit at these tables, so what the hell did they care? Dory settled down at the far end of the crescent. Pepper took 15 minutes to catch up, no joke. A walk of no more than 10 feet took him a quarter of an hour. He regretted waiting to make his phone call more and more. Having breakfast in this place only seemed like he meant to stay. Sitting down gave Pepper trouble too. He had to coordinate pulling the chair out without being in its way. He had to aim his butt at the chair cushion and not smack into the armrest instead. And he had to scoot forward in his chair, which meant working up some traction between his thermal socks and the tiled floor. The man had sweat on his forehead when he finally picked up his fork. Dory smiled widely. "Those meds are murder, aren't they?" There were other patients gathered at the tables on the other end by the TV mounted to the wall. Some sat with their breakfast trays in their laps and their heads cocked back so they could see the 32-inch flat screen. 8 patients stared at it, men and women pawing blindly at their breakfast trays. Their mouths hung open and their eyes looked heavy in post-dosage stupor. What else could they do to ride the dosage out but watch television? Pepper couldn't even manage that. The news played, though what was on hardly seemed to matter. The patients watched commercials and weather reports as intently as breaking news when they were in this state. Pepper tried to focus on his breakfast tray, a small box of cereal, a green apple, an 8-ounce carton of milk, a 4-ounce juice cup, 2 pieces of white toast, and a set of plastic utensils. Very little of this stuff actually qualified as food. Food-like, maybe. Pepper looked away from his tray, slowly raising his eyes, if not his entire head, to peek at the half-court outside. But what he saw just beyond the court was the same chain-link metal fence topped by barbed wire. The door to the half-court had 3 locks. How am I here? Pepper wanted to ask. But he couldn't form the words. Not only was his body still working at sludge speeds, but now his mouth was so dry he could feel the bumps of his tongue against the roof of his mouth. He needed a sip of that juice, the most appetizing item on the tray. He meant to move his arms to grab the tiny cup, but couldn't. His fingers didn't work either. Dory watched him struggle without offering help. It wasn't that she was being cruel, it was that she was on meds too. Pepper recognized it on her face. She smiled widely again. Had he said something funny, or was she reacting on delay to something she'd heard minutes ago? He stared into her mouth. Dory had tombstone teeth, bent at all angles and going gray. Her giant glasses showed streaks like a window that's been wet but not wiped clean. She wore the same blue nightdress from the night before. She was the kind of person Pepper might have given change to on a subway and never thought about again. Not a good thing to admit, but it was true. And now here he was, looking to her for help with his meager breakfast. His thirst overwhelmed him. Dory, he whispered. Speaking just that one word, and barely a whisper, made his parched throat burn. He puckered his lips. He opened and closed them. He stared down at the breakfast tray, at the juice carton, and hoped she understood. Dory said, "Do you know much about the American buffalo?" It took Pepper a moment to register how mind-bogglingly random Dory's question was. If he'd been in control of himself, he might have chucked his table at her out of frustration. But he couldn't do much of anything. He watched the little juice cup with an almost romantic longing. Dory rose from her chair. She shuffled around the table. 200 years ago, or something like that, the American buffalo dominated the West. There were millions of the great beasts, running in herds so big it sounded like thunder rolling towards you. A population of 5 million, 10 million, maybe more. Pepper couldn't quite focus on her words. By now his mind seemed to be floating or sinking. Either way, his brain was an untethered balloon. If he hadn't been able to see the tabletop right in front of him, see his arms balanced on the chair's armrests, he would have thought he'd been let loose to float into the sky. His throat felt so dry. When the settlers started crossing the country in droves, the American buffalo met its match. People wanted the skins for warmth. They ate the meat. They used the horns and the bones and all the rest. Those Native Americans used even more of the animal, but they hunted it all out of proportion too. Used it for themselves and sold it to the settlers. The American buffalo became big business, and nothing stands in the way of that. In no time, maybe 3 years, those beautiful beasts were almost extinct. Dory stood by his side now. She reached across his tray for the 4-ounce juice cup, but she couldn't pull the foil top off the thing. Even though she'd been on the unit for much, much, much longer than Pepper, she too had been walloped by her morning dose. What she took would have put Pepper into a coma. People used to go out and hunt them with rifles. Hell, they even leaned out of moving trains and picked the buffalo off with pot shots. They also call the American buffalo a bison. Same animal, 2 names. Don't know why that happened. Dory finally opened the juice, like Pepper used to do when he was a kid, enjoying a quart of water after school. She popped 2 holes with her teeth, then jabbed 1 finger inside to make a kind of spout. She tilted back Pepper's head and opened his mouth. But the worst way to kill them, in mass numbers, was to drive a herd toward the edge of a cliff and just make all those big dumb things jump right off. It was messy. Some people think the men did it just for fun. Or maybe it was more efficient, didn't use any bullets, and you had all of them right there at the bottom of the cliff. The sight from above must have been something truly hellish. Just thousands of bison broken into pieces, heads and hooves and tails and guts, blood everywhere. Some of them didn't die right away. They might be down there snorting and wheezing and slowly drifting off to a death, but it hardly counted as a loss for anyone but the buffalo. Even though it sounds wasteful, the profits were so big, it didn't matter. Dory finished by slowly pouring the apple juice into Pepper's mouth. Pepper's arms shivered and his tongue expanded like a sponge. His eyes focused on the old woman standing over him. He smiled at her, a mama bird feeding its chick. After drinking 2 ounces, he regained some control of his body. He raised one hand and took the juice from Dory, sat up straighter, and slurped the rest himself. And Dory returned to her chair, snatched both pieces of toast off his tray, and winked. The price of partnership. Pepper grabbed the green apple and bit it once, a chomp so huge it exposed the core. After he finished chewing, he asked, Dory, why did you tell me that story about the buffalo? It's horrible. They laughed and the mood seemed to lighten. Then Dory said, I want you to understand where you found yourself, big boy. In here we're the buffalo, and New Hyde is the cliff. So that's Dory giving a very heartening and upbeat introduction to the hospital where they have found themselves. Yeah. But I want to introduce the second character now. Read a little section with him. The second character is a character named Coffee, who is an African immigrant, a Ugandan immigrant, who Pepper meets on his first night in the hospital. And on the first night when Pepper comes in, the way they meet is that Pepper is knocked out with those pills, and Coffee just comes over and just starts poking him in the back of the neck until he wakes up, and then just panhandles for quarters. And you find out that Coffee panhandles everybody for quarters. And Coffee was based on a dude 2 years ago, I think, or 3 years ago. My wife and I went to Uganda, which is where my mom's side of the family is from, so that's why the immigrant there is from Uganda, autobiographically speaking. We went to Uganda, and we had an escort who was this like super ambitious, super educated, and super wealthy young person. And then we had a driver who was a dude named Sunday, who was 10 years older. And what was great was, so the woman who took us around, she was connected to everybody. If we wanted to meet the president, she could have had us meet the president. But she also was, like people who are connected, less willing to tell the truth about things because they are invested in those things. So what was great about Sunday, was the actual driver's name, is we would go to some event and the president would talk and there would be all these generals talking, and we'd come back in and she would give us the spin that was the sort of proper spin on things, and then she would step out of the car, and then Sunday would just say they're all corrupt and they're all devils. And we would just go, wow, okay, and I would just write it in my little book. I got the other side of things, you know. And so Sunday became this guy who just became, he began to seem, in the beginning he was sort of treated like just the lackey, the dumb servant, essentially, by everybody who we met. And 2 days into the trip, I understood he was the sanest human being I was going to meet, and he was the only person I could trust. Whatever we went through, I would come back to him and be like, what did we just see? And then he would say, here's what you saw. And it was always like, well, you know, these people are corrupt, and they brought you to these corrupt people because those people will tell you the truth, but they're not getting any money because they're from the wrong tribe, blah, 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 blah. And it all went in the open, right? So that's for a different book. But he inspired this character named Coffee, who in the beginning, like I said, is this panhandler who you just think is nuts. But what you come to realize is that, I don't think I'm spoiling anything, what he's actually panhandling for these, the reason he wants these quarters is because he's trying to reach, on the payphones, he's trying to reach anybody in city government, federal government, the press, anyone, to report the abuses going on inside the hospital. But because he's just a crazy dude on the phone, absolutely no one is interested in hearing what he has to say, right? So I thought for me that sort of captured what Sunday, the real Sunday, had been like. And so I wanted to just read this little scene where Pepper and Coffee have a little confrontation. This is right after the scene I've just read, when he just took the when Pepper and Dory just had breakfast. Payphones, Dory said. I can make as many calls as I want, Pepper asked, surprised that prisoners were limited to just one, but mental patients had unlimited access. As long as you got the money, she said. He had the change right in the pocket of the slacks he'd slept in. Pepper reached into the pocket and pulled out the coins. Only then did he realize the act of balance he'd just achieved. A minor feat for anyone over 2 years old, agreed. But you'd be surprised how that medication makes you feel like a wobbly infant. It had been 2 hours since he'd swallowed the morning meds, and he still didn't feel clear-headed. But maybe they had lost their worst effects. The change in his palm looked like shiny communion wafers. The alcove wasn't terribly big, There were 2 payphones, and both were in use by the same guy, Pepper's roommate. He held one receiver to his right ear, the other was balanced on his left shoulder. He looked like an old-time receptionist, putting through calls. He didn't notice Pepper, even in that cramped space. This guy had admirable powers of concentration. Either that or he was just ignoring the big man. The roommate spoke into the phone by his right ear. "Yes, I will hold." Then he set that phone onto his right shoulder and lifted the other one to his left ear and said, "Hello? Hello? Come on!" But he'd already been put on hold on that phone too. Dory peeked in. She said, "That's Coffee." At least Pepper had a name for the enemy. "I should warn you," she said. "I wouldn't go around flashing my change like that." She pointed at Pepper's open hand and he closed his fingers. "Coffee's gonna ask for money if he sees that." "He already did. He's my roommate." Dory winced like someone who's just touched an open flame. "For the first time since I've met you, I actually feel sorry for you," she said. Pepper walked right up to the still oblivious Coffee, who had returned to the phone at his right ear. His eyes were tilted upward as he listened to the hold message play for the 5th time in a row. That's why he didn't understand what was happening when Pepper snatched the other receiver out of his left hand to hang up the line. "I'm using this phone now," Pepper said. Pepper stood half a foot taller than Coffee, but more important, Pepper outweighed Coffee by at least 80 pounds. And Pepper's face, with its high, flared nostrils and bared teeth, looked about as pleasant as an etching of a Chinese demon. The sensible reaction for Coffee would have been to make peace, or even to get his ass out of the alcove. But let's say this for Coffee, the man was out of his mind. Coffee squared right up to Pepper, chest to belly, then he spat in Pepper's face. The saliva struck the big man's chin, slid down and hung there like a chrysalis for a full 3 seconds before Pepper hit the man. Actually, he crushed him. The alcove didn't have enough room for real blows to get thrown, so instead, Pepper threw himself. The smaller man got caught between a wall and 272 pounds of medicated murderousness. Coffee might as well have been ground into a fine powder, ready for the French press. Coffee howled and went down to the floor. The other receiver slipped out of his right hand, striking against one wall like a gavel. A recorded announcement played from the receiver, repeating what it had already been saying for many minutes. "Thank you for calling 311 in New York City. We're here to help." Coffee was curled on the ground, hands over his face. Pepper stooped over him. Pepper wanted to thump this guy for spitting on him. Really one of the most cowardly and disgusting moves a person can pull in a fight. But before he could do more, Pepper felt that saliva dripping down onto his neck, and he panicked. What if this dude's spit had passed through his lips, even just a little bit, and gone down his throat? AIDS? Hepatitis C? Who knew what could happen? The moment the thought came up, it was impossible to put down. He stuck his tongue out and pressed it to the sleeve of his shirt, licking his arm to clean his tongue, coughing loudly. So try to imagine what the orderly and the other staff members saw when they entered the alcove. Drawn in by Coffee's screams and Pepper's retching, the staff found a very large man standing over a smaller one, menacing the smaller one who was, even now, scrambling to get hold of the dangling payphone receiver to try his call again. And the big man was, what the hell else could you say, licking himself. Crazy balls. The scene was absolutely crazy balls. The orderly sucked his teeth. He stared up at Pepper with distaste. "Damn, my man." Pepper stopped applying his tongue to the fabric of his shirt and turned toward the orderly. Below them both, Coffee spoke urgently into the phone. "Hello," he whimpered. "Please, I've seen it. I know where it lives." "Thank you for calling 311. Two nurses poked their heads into the alcove, but with Coffee, Pepper, and the orderly already inside, there was no more room. From farther outside the alcove, one nurse shouted, "What's this foolishness?" The orderly called out, "New patient attacked Coffee." Hearing it like that from a staff member made Pepper understand what he'd just done. Hadn't he resolved to control himself in here, to make the best impression he could? But getting spat on had to count as a mitigating circumstance. Pepper wanted to explain. "I needed to make a phone call," he began. The orderly waved the words away. "I'm taking you back to your room now, and you're going to stay in there for the rest of the day. You hear?" Coffee rose to his feet, pushing himself up with his back against the wall. He shook the receiver of the phone Pepper had hung up. "Now you owe me a quarter." Pepper said, "This guy was using both phones, and The orderly stepped closer to Pepper. They were squared up just like Pepper and Coffee had been. But this guy wouldn't have to spit on anyone to make his point. That was clear. Save that shit," he said. "You can explain all that to the doctor." In defiance, desperation, and drugged-out confusion, Pepper grabbed the phone on the left. Lifting the receiver out of its cradle, he'd make his phone call. But the orderly wouldn't let that happen. He pressed 2 fingers down on the cradle, and the dial tone choked before Pepper even got the phone to his ear. Then, another quick flash of temper, Pepper half raised the receiver like he'd bring it down on the orderly's head. But he stopped himself from making a bad day terrible and put the phone back in the cradle. The orderly grinned. That's the smartest move you've made, big boy. First smart move since you got here." Oh, how Pepper would have loved to pick up Coffee and use him to bludgeon the orderly to death. Would that count as black-on-black crime? The orderly spoke with a mix of compassion and condescension. "You calm now? All right, let's go. You and me, back to your room." As Pepper followed him out of the alcove, Coffee still clung to the payphone like a man adrift, trying to stay afloat. The receiver was tucked against his ear. The automated voice on the other end thanked him once again for calling. Coffee whispered quietly, "It's here." I'll stop there. Thanks. So traditionally, since we have a little bit of time, this is where the Q&A portion of things happens. And almost without fail, no one has a question for the first couple minutes. It's just people are nervous, whatever you want, or maybe you just have no questions. And so after, thank you. Already, this is a charged crowd. And also I know him.
Yeah.
So.
I'm playing. Does the person who inspired Dory know that she's inspiration for Dory?
The person who inspired Dory is dead. Yeah. The other thing is like, this woman Dorinda, she published I think one book, a memoir about having been a film star, like a minor film star in I want to say the 40s or something like that. And I thought it pretty fascinating life. And she was there working on another memoir, I think about old age or something. And just the next thing when I looked her up when I was almost done with this, I was gonna write her to say, "Can I thank you in the book? And do you mind if I name you?" And I saw she had died. So, yeah. I mean, I don't know that she would have cared or even been flattered. I said, "Fuck you. This is not very nice." But I hope that she felt like it was a decent portrait. And the same with the dude who played Sunday. If I can ever get back in touch with him, I mean, I sent him a copy too, but quite frankly, I don't think he's gonna care either. I mean, he has much more things. He had a lot of other things to deal with in his day. Believe me. So, all right. So I'm going to tell a little story. So even if at the end of this, everyone just decides, we're done for the night, that's all right with me. It's been a long day. But this is like the best part of the day, honestly, except for my kid. That's the better part. This is the second best part of the day. Since I know a number of you folks in here, and I know a number of you are writers, I thought it would be a funny story to tell on this is like my last reading for a while, and so whatever. So this idea of like, who do you taking from real life to make characters, and how do you use whatever you have? So while I was working on this book, I think this is a funny story at least. I got this really shitty little short review in the New York Times Book Review, right? I felt it was, I mean, at the same time I was honored that they even mentioned the book, because that in itself is rare. But then I felt like, and then this guy said some things I just, didn't like. He just didn't like the book is what it was. This last book, not this one, but the previous one, Big Machine. And I sort of thought, like, there's all these stories now about like how writers misuse a moment like that. So famously, there have been some writers who go on Twitter and they put like, here's the phone number of the person who gave me a bad review. I hope all my fans will call them and harass them to no end. And and so we agree, like, that is not a good way to deal with it, right? Another bad way was just like people who write impassioned like letters to the editor, where they essentially do the same thing, and they say like, you just didn't get what I mean. I'm a genius. but you know, like it's a different kind of defensiveness, and I felt that same defensiveness, of course. But I was trying to figure out like how could I use this in some way that benefits me instead of just making harms me and you know and hurts something. So I was working on this, and there was an integral character, a character who's integral to the book. Toward the very end, there's one of the main characters is trying to make an escape out of the hospital, and she basically gets help from this tertiary character who I needed to use for just a couple pages, and I kind of thought like, okay, maybe this is where I can sort of vent these feelings, because this character is a rat, and I decided, okay, I'm going to name the rat the name of my reviewer, right? So the reviewer's real name was Tom LeClaire, and in the book, the character's name is LeClaire the rat. And I enjoyed for like 5 pages, again, I just named him. I didn't just ever just say LeClaire. I always say LeClaire the rat was walking down a garbage chute. LeClaire the rat. And then I built kind of a bigger story about it, because the idea is he's the only rat left he's the only creature besides the patients left in the hospital, because the monster of the title, the Devil in Silver, has essentially scared off every spider, fly, roach, and in theory every other rat. But in this little bit of story, you also find out that part of the reason all the other rats left New Hyde Hospital is because they're scared of the Devil in Silver. But the other reason is because they all think LeClaire the rat is a pompous jerk. And he's too full of himself, and he thinks his opinion is the only opinion that's worthwhile, and he loves to go on and on about what he thinks is the best way to talk about something important. And I just spewed everything I could, you know, in these 5 pages. And in the early draft, he then dies. You know what I mean? I just was sort of like, everything is just going to come out in this. Like the character who's escaping essentially stomps him at the end, which was also hard to believe how someone could just stomp a rat inside an air duct, but that's what I had happen. But in the last drafts of it, because I started to actually like the rat, I still didn't like the reviewer, but I liked the rat, and I started to care about him, and I started to think maybe the rat actually also needs the chance for redemption, because the point of the book is that all these people who you overlook, people who we think are beyond redemption, are not. And so in the last draft, in the very last thing before I send it off, and now in the book, even the rat, even LeClaire the rat, ends up being good. And he's a jerk. Everyone dislikes him. He's pompous. There's no disagreement that he's worthless, but even he finds a way to snatch some goodness out of his worthless, bitter soul, is the idea that, as I saw it. And I did feel like for me it was a lesson as well. Like, you know, it can you can begin with these feelings that are grudging and terrible, but if it stays like that, then you know just save that for your diary, save that for your therapist, save that for your Facebook page even, because even that is not. Well, I mean, everyone sees that, but it's not published, you know. But I felt like it's a thing worth sharing, since I know a number of you in the room are friends and writers. And just that idea, that transformation from that to that, and also because I also just I feel like I haven't told that story anywhere, and I just wanted to say it out loud. That that's what I had done with my own thin-skinned pettiness.